Why Jeffery Dahmer's inmate killed him. Introduction. On July 22, 1991, Jeffery Dahmer confessed to one of the most disturbing crimes in American history. For over a decade, he had prowled the streets of Milwaukee and killed 17 men, with his youngest victim being just 14 years old. But what makes this story tragic is not just the people he murdered, but the horrific manner in which he decapitated and preserved his victims, storing their body parts in his one-bedroom apartment to the point of eating them. Even after he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences in prison, Dahmer continued to make sick jokes about his victims, shaping his food into body parts and using ketchup as blood as if relieving his gruesome murders. Killings. His first victim was Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker who had requested for a ride to town. During the drive, Dahmer asked Stephen to join him for a few bottles of beer in his house, and the young man agreed. After a few hours of drinking and talking, Stephen decided to leave, but Jeffery refused and struck him on the head with a dumbbell. He then proceeded to strangle him to death before hiding the body in his parents' basement. The following day, Dahmer cut up the lifeless body and buried the remains in a shallow grave in his parents' backyard. But he wasn't done. A few weeks later, he dug up the remains and proceeded to melt them in acid before flushing the dissolved flesh down the toilet. Using a sledgehammer, he crushed the bones into tiny bits and scattered them in the woods behind the house. Over the next 13 years, Dahmer would lure men and young boys into his apartment with promises of sex or money, only to kill them and perform a series of diabolic rituals with their remains. As his killings increased, his rituals became even darker. He would roast and dry body parts in his oven to eat or keep as mementos. He had a strong obsession with possessing people and later told the police that he ate the parts of those he killed as a way of remembering and holding on to them. His later murders involved him sleeping with the dead bodies, preserving the dismembered heads and body parts in his freezer. He also started performing twisted experiments on his victims by drilling into their skulls while they were still heavily sedated. According to him, one of his victims woke up during the experiment, and he had no choice but to strangle him to death. Throughout the years, he committed the crimes no one suspected him. Even his eventual arrest was accidental. With his glasses on, Dahmer had an innocent demeanor that could pass for a typical nerd or a reserved next-door neighbor. He was also going to work at the Ambrosia chocolate factory, making him even less suspicious. No one would have expected this seemingly unassuming person to be capable of such gruesome murders. Childhood. Before his first killing, Dahmer had been exhibiting strange behaviors while growing up. At the age of 8, he asked his father during a chicken dinner what would happen if the chicken's bones were placed in bleach. His father, who was a research chemist, thought his son's question was out of scientific curiosity, so he showed him the process. This was the beginning of Jeffrey's obsession. He started collecting skeletons of dead animals and preserving them in jars of formaldehyde. He gradually went from collecting dead animals to killing squirrels and other small animals, storing them in jars of formaldehyde and preserving their bones. One time he decapitated a dog's head from its body, then pranked his friends with its skull impaled on a stick. As Dahmer grew, his obsession also grew darker. He started fantasizing about dominating or completely possessing people. He was also drinking heavily and finding men more attractive, especially their chest and torso area. At the age of 18, Dahmer murdered his first victim in his family house in Ohio. He had the house to himself for weeks so no one suspected anything as he hacked and pulverized the body of 18-year-old Stephen Hicks. Dahmer didn't kill anyone again until 9 years later. Before then he got into Ohio State University where he only spent one semester before dropping out, much to his father's disappointment. Dahmer's father had assumed that his son's interest in science would encourage him to become a surgeon or a chemist like him. But Dahmer's interest in academics was non-existent. After college, Dahmer enlisted into the army, but his constant intoxication got him kicked out after only 1 year in service. Back in Ohio, Dahmer lived with his father and stepmother while still drinking heavily. His alcohol addiction became worse, so his father sent him to live with his paternal grandmother with hopes that she would be able to wean him off it. Dahmer seemed to listen to his grandmother more than anyone, and at first the arrangement worked out. He found a job, cleaned, and even went to church with his grandmother, but this only lasted for a few months. Dahmer started drinking heavily again and was soon arrested for indecent exposure in a public park. His teenage fantasies of dominance and control also started coming back, and he started to frequent gay bars and bathhouses in Milwaukee. In 1986, Dahmer was arrested for masturbating in front of two 12-year-olds. Tragically, one of the boys would turn out to be the brother of his youngest victim. His charge earned him a sentence of 1 year probation and counseling. However, Dahmer's probation officer never truly checked in with him. Second victim. A year later, Dahmer murdered his second victim, Stephen Twomey, in a hotel room in Milwaukee. Although he claimed not to have any memories of the incident. According to him, he paid the 25-year-old for sex only to wake up to his dead body the next morning. He then stuffed Twomey's body in a suitcase before taking it to his grandmother's basement, where he dismembered the body parts like he did his first victim. For the next few years, Dahmer continued his killing spree, luring young men into his house with promises of money or sex, only to drug them and take control of their body. At some point, he moved from his grandmother's house and rented a one-room apartment in Milwaukee. Accidental arrest. By 1991, Dahmer had murdered 17 young boys and men, killing one person each week in June and July. His last victim, Tracy Edwards, would have been the 18th if not for his quick thinking. That night, Dahmer had lured Edwards into his house by offering him $100 to pose nude for photographs. Edward accepted and followed Dahmer to his apartment, where he was offered a bottle of beer. Inside, Dahmer put handcuffs on one of his wrists, but Edwards thought it was still part of the show. In an instant he saw Dahmer suddenly transform into a crazed killer, brandishing a butcher knife and threatening to kill him and eat his heart. He was also chanting words from the Exorcist movie that was playing in the background. It was there that Edwards pretended to calm him down, and as soon as Dahmer let his guard down, he hit him and ran out of the apartment with the handcuffs still dangling on one wrist. Outside, he flagged down a patrol car and told them about his ordeal, showing them his handcuffs. The policeman, thinking that the situation was a lover's quarrel, followed Edwards back to Dahmer's apartment and would have left immediately if one of them hadn't spotted the disturbing pictures in Dahmer's bedroom. Upon further investigation, they found different body parts of his victims, including 4 human heads stored in his refrigerator, a blue barrel containing the acid he used to dissolve the bodies, skeletons and severed body parts stored in wooden boxes and jars. They also recovered disturbing photographs of his victims in various stages of dismemberment. Dahmer was immediately arrested and taken into custody, where he revealed more horrifying details of his atrocities. It was as if he knew the end had come, the way he willingly confessed the extent of his debauchery. Trial. On January 30, 1992, Dahmer pleaded guilty on the basis of insanity to 15 counts of murder. Throughout his trial period, Dahmer showed immense remorse, claiming to have been mentally unstable. Mental health professionals and psychiatric experts were brought in to ascertain his claim, but Dahmer was deemed to be legally sane at the time he committed the murders. After about 2 weeks of a widely publicized trial, Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences in the Columbia Correctional Institution. There he was placed in solitary confinement due to concerns about his safety with the other inmates. While alone, Dahmer devoted himself to reading the Bible and became a born-again Christian. After 1 year in solitary confinement, Dahmer pleaded to be transferred to a less secure unit, claiming to have been of good conduct throughout his isolation period. His request was granted and he was transferred to a less isolated unit, where he was assigned a 2-hour work duty of cleaning the toilet block. In 1994, Dahmer, who now identified as a Christian, was baptized by a church minister whom he chose to confess his sins to. Every week, the priest visited Dahmer and they would talk about God and his previous life. His recent actions raised new fans who argued that he himself was a victim of a broken home. He started receiving gifts, letters and cash, which he spent on cigarettes and magazines. He knew to say the right things to redeem his image outside. However, the families of the people he murdered did not fall for his remorseful facade. His fellow inmates also knew the real Dahmer, especially as he was fond of taunting inmates. He would arrange his food into the shape of a severed body part, pour ketchup on it to make it look like blood, and then eat while muttering to himself how good it tasted. His behavior caused many of his fellow inmates to resent him. One even attempted to slash his throat with a razor embedded in a toothbrush. Dahmer escaped unscathed, but that was not the last attempt on his life. Christopher Scarver. In November, another inmate made an attempt to end Dahmer's life. It was Scarver. Christopher Scarver was serving a life sentence for shooting his boss during a payment quarrel in 1990. He, like other inmates, was repulsed by the presence of a psychotic man-eating cannibal amidst them. His pretentious nature in front of the press also made him more resentful. Like many, he couldn't stomach the horrible things he read in the newspaper about Dahmer and believed that he should have gotten a death sentence. And that was what he did. In the early hours of November 28, 1994, Dahmer and his cleaning partner Anderson walked into the gym toilet to perform their assigned duties. This had been their routine for the past few months. However, that morning the duo was joined by Scarver, who apparently was also assigned to clean with them. We may never know whether it was a coincidence that the trio were left unsupervised, but we do know that Scarver had ulterior motives. While they were cleaning, Scarver heard Dahmer and Jefferson laughing behind him. A few minutes later, Dahmer walked into a bathroom stall to clean it. Scarver quietly followed and repeatedly struck Dahmer on the head with a metal bar. Once he was sure Dahmer was unconscious, he went after Jefferson and pounced on him too before he was restrained by prison guards. Dahmer and Jefferson were still alive when they were found lying on the bathroom floor, but Dahmer died of head injuries shortly after he was rushed to the hospital, while Jefferson died of his wounds 2 days later. Dahmer's death was met with mixed reactions, with some including the victims' families praising Scarver for finally delivering justice and doing the society a favor. When asked why he did what he did, Scarver said that God told him to kill Dahmer. His action earned him additional life terms and he was ultimately transferred to a federal prison.